Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Gregory Wilbert, joining you from Quito, Ecuador. Last week, on October 5th, Colombian police officers opened fire on a peaceful protest against coca crop eradication. They killed between 6 and 15 farmers and injured over 50, in what some are calling the worst massacre in Colombia in the last 15 years. Shortly thereafter, on Sunday, October 8, police again opened fire on a group of journalists and investigators who were examining the scene, the earlier scene of the shooting. Luckily, no one was killed during the second incident, and police later even apologized. Originally, the government of President Juan Manuel Santos denied any responsibility for the October 5th attack on protesters, but then backtracked on Wednesday, and the defense minister suspended about 100 police officers from duty for their involvement. Joining us to take a closer look at these developments is Mario Murillo. Mario is professor of communications and Latin American Caribbean Studies at Hofstra University, and he's the author of the book Colombia and the United States, War, Unrest, and Destabilization. Thanks for joining us, Mario.
It's great to be with you, Greg. Thanks for having me.
So let's first go over exactly what happened in the village of Tandil, Colombia last week. Can you give us a brief update?
Well, again, the picture is pretty sketchy. The government continues to deliberately make it seem as if the people responsible were not necessarily the security forces that were there, and it's been hard to get to a one consistent picture. But essentially, what you have is protesters, local farmers, peasant farmers cultivating coca, who are in the process of eradication, forced eradication on the part of the government, protesting that process without the government implementing any kind of alternative for them. And so the protesters went out and were confronted by the security forces, who were there essentially to carry out the forced eradication project. And again, that's where the picture gets sketchy, but essentially what we see is about anywhere between 6 and 12 people. Even the numbers aren't totally clear as to how many people were killed. The government acknowledges 6 peasants were killed, although eyewitnesses say that the number of others were killed, and in fact that some are even disappeared and are not accounted for. So that's kind of what happened on the ground. The government initially blamed the so-called dissident or kind of breakout remaining FARC group, a rebel group that has not been part of the peace accord that was signed last year, that were putting pressure on farmers to go out there and mobilize, once again revisiting the language and a discourse that the government has used for decades, implicating any kind of social protest against the government policies as if it were being manipulated by rebel forces, by the FARC guerrillas. And so the government has accused the FARC, or remnants of the FARC, not the actual FARC rebels, for having kind of forced them to be there. But the campesinos have said, no, we were not forced to do anything. We protest precisely because of the contradictory policies of the government. In this process of, on the one hand, voluntary eradication, but what it really has become has been a forced eradication program. And what it is, it relates to the two of the most complicated components of the 6-point peace accord that was signed last year, which we can get into now.
Well, I just want to, before we get into that part, I just want to say that, activists in the region have said that the police are denying them access and it's been very difficult to investigate. But on the other hand, President Santos had the defense minister suspend 100 police officers for their involvement. So what do you think is going on behind the scenes there? I mean, who's ultimately responsible for what happened?
Well, I think they acknowledge basically that there was a complete breakdown there, supposedly, in terms of what the government forces were supposed to do. And there's just too much eyewitness testimony being reported by all the Colombian media and peasants and people who eyewitnesses who have been interviewed, who pointed out that clearly this was something that was carried out by the security forces, by the police. And so I think Santos had his hands tied and had to do something about that. And so it was a bit of good news in the beginning of this week when those officials were fired. There were police, about the number of high-end officials, about 20 officers, as well as about 100 or so rank-and-file police officers were taken off duty, and that was again most likely based on the response of the local community that was very angry about what had occurred. But on the other hand, they're still hinting and using the same language that this was not necessarily the fault of the police. That in fact that there was kind of fire, shooting coming from the so-called dissident forces, forced by this so-called alias El Guacho, who was one of these commanders of the dissident forces that have continued their war against the government, but really carrying out their support of the coca trade in that part of the region. But that's again one of those contradictions in Colombian policy right now that is leading to a lot of the problems. On the one hand, the government is, as part of the peace accord that was signed last year, they're saying that yes, we're going to have a manual eradication, substitution, voluntary substitution for the coca growing regions all over the country, not only in Tumaco but in all different parts of the country. But on the other hand, if they don't comply immediately, there's going to be this forced eradication, which is clearly going to lead to confrontation. And unfortunately, the confrontation that we saw over the weekend and last week was resulted in this terrible violence and terrible result.
Then just a couple of days ago, there was another killing that is Ifigenia Vázquez Astudillo, who's an indigenous broadcaster in the Cauca region, a department of Colombia, was killed by the anti-riot police. What can you tell us about what happened there?
Well, this is the result of mobilizations that have been taking place, again, as you point out, in Cauca, which is about a little bit northeast of Tumaco, which is also on the southwest part of the country. Indigenous community of the Coconuco people, one of the many indigenous nations that essentially were at the forefront of the indigenous movement in Colombia back in the 1970s, a very highly organized, very mobilized community, and they've, for the last several months, I think it's been over a year, in which they've been protesting the privatization of a territory in the Coconuco land that is being privatized to developers who are going to create kind of a resort out of a sacred territory called Aguas Tibias. That area has a number of different springs, thermal springs that are very sacred to the Coconuco people. The Coconuco community had and has developed one of those springs as their own eco-resort, run and controlled by the local indigenous council. And it's very much open to the communities, not only indigenous, but other communities. And what they've been saying, as part of an agreement that was signed with the government about 2 years ago, that some of that land, that other spring, Aguas Tibias, also had to be returned to the indigenous community, so that way they can control it and take control of it. However, what the government has said is that no, we've already made this deal, and this developer is going to take it. So they've been protesting that now for several months. Over the summer, there was a number of confrontations between police forces, the same ESMAD that carried out the attack in Tumaco, the same forces. They're sort of like SWAT police, heavily armed. They look like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles out there fight, but with heavy armed weapons, confronting the communities that were protesting. I have a good friend who was at that protest back in August, saying that the police were spared they were ruthless in dismantling and moving the communities aside. So what happened was, in covering that report and covering that latest development, one of the reporters from the local radio station, Renacer Estéreo, which is run by the Coconucos, one of the many indigenous community radio stations in Colombia, that she was covering the situation, and she got shot by ESMAD. The ESMAD is denying that. They're saying that she was killed accidentally by one of the indigenous communities themselves, a representative of the indigenous community themselves. But the communities and the eyewitnesses say absolutely not. This is just another example of the real heavy-handed tactics that are being used against social protests right now in Colombia.
Well, according to numerous human rights groups in Colombia right now, over 100 activists and social leaders were killed in the first 6 months of this year. So, and I imagine, not most of them, I guess, weren't killed by the police, but recently there seems to have been an increase of police activity or responsibility for these killings, it seems. How does all of this affect the peace agreement that you mentioned earlier between the government and the FARC guerrilla group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which, the agreement which was just signed last year?
Well, this is revisiting a history that Colombia has already lived through in previous attempts at trying to reach some kind of reconciliation and peace in the country. In the 1980s, when there was a peace accord or an attempt to sign a peace accord between the FARC and the government, the FARC, in its attempt to try to create a political party, established the Patriotic Union. They had a political party that had won a number of seats in the Congress, and they were winning municipalities, and it had a number of very popular presidential candidates. And as a result of that, the right-wing backlash was ruthless. Over 3,000, some estimates say up to 4,000 militants, from grassroots activists to two presidential candidates of the Patriotic Union, were killed. Essentially a social cleansing that took place against the left party. Many analysts point to that as the militarization of the FARC really started after that period. And what we've seen is always kind of an attack from the right, from the ultra-right in Colombia, against any kind of social protest and any kind of reconciliation attempts or any kind of concessions supposedly given to the FARC rebels. Unfortunately, the targets of this violence that we're seeing are social activists, human rights workers, indigenous communities, environmentalists, all of whom are mobilizing and struggling around issues of land reform, around sustainable economic development, about green issues in many parts of the country, and also about bringing justice to those family members and people who have been killed over the years after decades of dirty war from the right and from state security forces. And so these are the people that are being targeted, and it's no accident, because these are the people who have also been most supportive of trying to reach a peace deal and pushing forward and implementing the peace accords that were signed last year. So unfortunately, there was a lot of predictions of that prior to the peace signing, and we've seen that that's pretty much what's been going on. There's been a rebirth, if you will, of so-called paramilitary groups, groups that in many ways never really dismantled from the 2000s, middle 2000s, during the peace accord that was signed between the government of Alvaro Uribe and the right-wing paramilitary groups. A lot of those groups are still functioning in many parts of the country, putting pressure on social activists, in many instances collaborating with military forces, as they did in the past, and targeting, of course, demobilized guerrilla fighters who are now in their camps and trying to be part of this reconciliation and kind of demobilization process. It's a real serious issue that could indeed derail a good portion of this post-conflict period, this peace process.
Finally, I just want to touch on one more thing. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to interview Pablo Beltran, the head negotiator of the National Liberation Army, of the other Colombian guerrilla group, which is currently just beginning on October 1st, its peace negotiations with the government. And these negotiations are just in full swing. They're just started. But with all of this violence occurring and this increase, really, and he talked about this as well, how do you see this affecting those second negotiations? Do you see any hope for them being concluded given these circumstances?
Well, we know the government of Santos is trying to push it, and there is a clamoring to hopefully get this done before the 2018 presidential elections. Unfortunately, Colombia is already kind of in campaign season, full swing campaigning, which in many ways is a problem, because the right has a pretty powerful presence in terms of the media and in terms of its ability to put a bad spin on anything that's happening in the country, vis-a-vis reconciliation, vis-a-vis some kind of peace deal with the ELN. But I want to go back to the issue of the Coca cultivation, because I think therein lies the biggest threat to any kind of peace agreement, or tranquility, or some kind of post-conflict period that's going to lead to peace and reconciliation in Colombia. The Coca issue revolves around two of the 6 major points of the peace accord themselves. One is the first point, which is about rural development, land reform, and recognizing the abject poverty in which the majority of the Colombian people live, as one of the precursors, one of the reasons why we've had such a long history of conflict in the countryside in particular. And the second point, or I should say the fourth point of the agenda, that's related to the first point, is the issue of coca cultivation and kind of weaning the countryside from coca cultivation cultivation and having the FARC play a role in ending the drug trade in Colombia. That's very complicated because it has so many international implications and other factors. But what's happening is, instead of recognizing that you have to address poverty, you have to address lack of development, you have to address the issue of no state presence in the countryside throughout the country for decades, which in many ways was the reason why the FARC were able to build strongholds around the country, places like Tumaco, places like Cauca, places like Antioquia, throughout the country, is because of the poverty, because of the lack of development. And what we're seeing is a return to the discourse of the Plan Colombia and the 1990s into the 2000s. That no, first we have to deal with the Coca situation. We have to eradicate and forcibly eradicate before we can start talking about the other kinds of development. And that language is really coming out of the Trump administration. The White House is putting a lot of pressure on Santos to show results in terms of coca cultivation. That's like their main obsession. How many hectares has been eradicated? And unfortunately, over the last year, we've seen an increase in coca cultivation in the countryside. There's a number of complex factors as to why that's happened. It's not directly related to the fact that the FARC guerrillas have demobilized or that the peace process is a failure, as the right wing is trying to point it to. But the bottom line is that there needs to be some kind of comprehensive plan to wean the farmers, the coca growers, from the coca trade and give them an economic alternative. And unfortunately, right now, the pressure is more in terms of the military aspect and the forced eradication, as opposed to looking at it as a much more comprehensive plan. And with Trump now threatening to decertify Colombia as a country cooperating with the so-called war on drugs, again, revisiting the language of the late 90s when Plan Colombia was being debated, Santos and the government of Colombia feels that pressure, and therein lies the contradiction in their policies, supposedly trying to create a voluntary substitution crop eradication program. At the same time, they're bringing the SWAT forces to go in there and confront the coca farmers. And that is a recipe for disaster. That's the explosion that we saw in Tumaco happen last week, and it's most likely going to continue to occur if that issue is not reconciled with more care, more subtlety, and more understanding of the complex economic and social situation on the ground in Colombia.
Okay, great. Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on what's going on and further developments, and we'll probably have you back very soon. I was speaking to Mario Murillo, Professor of Communications and Latin American Caribbean Studies at Hofstra University in New York. Thanks, Mario, for having joined us.
Thank you, Greg.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.